That sound has not been heard for 22 years. It is the sound of the Mumbles Train. The Mumbles Train ran from Swansea Town to Mumbles Pier. It carried 3 million passengers a year at its height. It ran through legal battles and ownership wrangles, 3 changes of locomotion, and 2 world wars. Its establishment was one of the proudest stories of endeavour and enterprise in the history of Swansea. And the facts we're about to reveal suggest its closure was one of the town's saddest episodes.
We present A Rock and Roll to Paradise, a dramatised history of the establishment, life and closure of the Mumbles Railway, the first passenger railway in the world.
On the 4th of July, 1804, a historic gathering assembled at the Bush Inn, Swansea.
I welcome to this the first meeting of the Oystermouth Railway or Tramroad Company, the most noble Henry Charles, Duke of Beaufort, 5 shares, Sir John Morris of Clasemont, Baronet, 5 shares, Edward Martin of Morriston, gentleman,
The meeting had assembled to inaugurate a new Oystermouth Railway. The Act establishing the railway had received parliamentary assent that year.
This Act, my lords, makes provision for the making and maintaining of a railway or tramroad to communicate with a certain place called the Brewery Bank within the town of Swansea to or near to a certain field called Castle Hill in the parish of Oystermouth.
And the chairman of the assembly, Sir John Morris, and the 19 prominent townspeople present at that first meeting were in a mood of high optimism.
Let me end, gentlemen, with the wish that the story of our enterprise and the name of Swansea's new Oystermouth Railway will ring down through the ages, linking our names and uniting our purpose with our successors in this century, the next century, the next century, and each century after that.
In common with many other railways established at the time, goods traffic first used the new Oystermouth line in April 1806. But in the spring of 1807, a local contractor approached the railway company with a unique and novel proposition.
That for a fixed sum to be agreed, the undermentioned Benjamin French be granted permission to run a wagon or wagons on the tramroad for a minimum period of 1 year for the conveyance of passengers.
Permission was duly granted. The first passenger carriages were established in March 1807, and reaction among the early travellers to this new form of transport was immediate.
I have never spent an afternoon with more delight than in exploring the romantic scenery at Oystermouth. I was conveyed there in a carriage of singular construction, built for the conveniency of parties who go hence to Oystermouth to spend the day. This car contains 12 persons and is constructed chiefly of iron. Its 4 wheels run on an iron railway by the aid of 1 horse, and the whole carriage is an easy and light vehicle.
Though not everyone was so enthusiastic.
We made an excursion to Oystermouth, a village near the western extremity of Swansea Bay, in a tram car. It is a very long carriage supported on 4 low iron rails, carries 16 persons, is drawn by 1 horse, and rattles along at the rate of 5 miles an hour with the noise of 20 sledgehammers in full play. The passage is only 4 miles long, but it is quite sufficient to make one reel from the car at the journey's end in a state of dizziness and confusion that it is well if one recovers in a week.
hardly an auspicious beginning. It was not believed to be so at the time. But the date of that first passenger journey, the 25th of March, 1807, was to become the most important date in the history of rail travel in the world. The Bush Inn meeting in 1804 had established more than just another railway. It had unwittingly inaugurated the entire era of passenger travel by rail. But the mood of high optimism that marked that first meeting was, sadly, not to last. In 1826, a road was constructed between Swansea and Oystermouth. And the convenience and comfort of the new road surface attracted the travellers in hordes. A more sombre General Assembly of the Railway Company had already been held in the Bush Inn on the 6th of July, 1825.
Gentlemen, this is an account of the tolls and dues received by the Oystermouth Railway December 1819 to December 1824.
Crippling mortgage loans had already plunged the railway into difficulties. With the prospect of the new road, the conclusion was inescapable.
The Oystermouth Railway, gentlemen, can no longer meet either the interest on its loans or the running costs on its operation.
Shame, shame.
And in 1827, the new Oystermouth Railway closed to passenger traffic for 33 years. Like so much of Welsh transport, the need for coal led to the revival of the line in 1860, this time to be transported from the Clyne Valley to Swansea. But the origins of this rebirth also lay in a little-noticed passage in the original Act of Incorporation in 1804.
This act is also to make clear, my lords, that the hailing and drawing of wagons and other carriages on the said Oystermouth Railway is to be achieved by men, by horses, or otherwise.
The inclusion of the words by men, by horses, or otherwise was not just a matter of legal phraseology. From its earliest days, it had been the intention of the promoters of the Oystermouth line that the railway be powered by steam. The most active supporter of steam traction among the early promoters was one Edward Martin, gentleman of Morriston.
For my part, I have no hesitation in declaring that if Mr. Trevithick's very ingenious steam machines can be brought to perfection, which some persons are confident they will be, and which there is every reason to hope for, then the possibility will arise of driving wagons on a tramroad by steam at a cheaper rate, by 50%, than it can be now done by horses.
Mr. Trevithick's very ingenious steam machines could not be brought to perfection in 1804. But they could some 50 years later. The line was relaid with edge rails, suitable for carrying steam trains, in 1855. Now under the ownership of the Swansea Improvements and Tramways Company, the Oystermouth line was reopened in 1860. Throughout the 1860s, the line experimented with the new steam trains. But when, in the 1870s, the proposals that steam replace horsepower reached their height, those original promoters would have found that some of their successors in Swansea were of a very different persuasion.
My objection to these steam trains is on the grounds of public safety. As mayor of this town, my concern is with the welfare of the citizens of Swansea. And these new engines are dirty, noisy, and will continually run the risk of bolting our horses and causing danger to life and limb.
The public debate raged between the Mayor of Swansea, Dr. James Rogers, and the General Manager of the Improvements Company, Mr. John Abbott.
Dr. Rogers' concern for his citizens is clouding his judgment of the facts. The steam engine my company proposed to use is of a type that can be worked without showing any steam, is practically noiseless, and shows no smoke, as coke is to be used as its fuel. Moreover, it is covered in, similarly to an ordinary car, and consequently does not frighten horses any more than an ordinary car.
To resolve the disagreement, a unique experiment was carried out on the 16th of August, 1877. The new steam engine, Pioneer, was attached to two large cars containing over 80 passengers and then ran along the railway track at a specified speed of 8 miles an hour. To test its effect, the mayor, Dr. Rogers, brought the head of his horse to within a couple of yards of the moving locomotive. The animal never turned a hair. And regular steam traction began the next day. Steam was to attract the passengers back like a magnet.
Gentlemen, gentlemen!
But a price was to be paid.
Gentlemen, I hereby give notice that the only lot of this auction, the track, stock and franchise of the Oystermouth Railway.
The new steam train had made the Oystermouth line a very attractive property. And the new steam age began with a series of complicated legal wrangles that led to the ownership of that new line transferring between two companies for the next 20 years of its life.
Sold to the gentleman on my left.
The gentlemen on the left formed themselves into the Swansea and Mumbles Railway Company. But though beaten at auction, the original owners of 1860 were not to give up so easily.
I refuse the application of the Swansea Improvements and Tramways Company to operate steam vehicles on the Oystermouth line. But grant the same company the right to operate horse-drawn vehicles immediately behind the steam vehicles of the Swansea and Mumbles Railway Company.
This compromise was put into effect. In 1879, in an attempt to pacify the warring factions, the Mumbles foreshore witnessed the sight of steam trains and horse carriages racing each other down from Swansea to Southend in order to pick up each other's passengers. It did not work well.
We must protest, my lord, that on several occasions, deep trenches have mysteriously appeared beneath the rails of the Oystermouth track, making it impossible for my client's horses to complete their journey. And on other occasions, my lord, repairs, initiated by the Swansea and Mumbles Railway Company, have resulted in red-hot cinders being laid around the line and track, again making it impossible that my client's horses continue with their service.
This extraordinary sight persisted until 1896.
The Swansea and Mumbles Railway Company, my lord, offer the Swansea Improvements and Tramways Company the figure of 1.5 pennies per head compensation for all passengers travelling between Gower Street and St Helens Junction, providing the Swansea Improvements and Tramways Company will undertake to withdraw their horse-drawn service.
The Improvements Company agreed. Horse-drawn carriages made their last appearance on the Mumbles Railway on the 31st of March, 1896. But the end of horse-drawn carriages did not spell the end for the Improvements Company. There was one last twist in this tale. In 1898, the full line to Mumbles Pier was completed. In that year, the Improvements Company passed into the control of the giant British Electric Traction. This new outfit now made a final bid for the steam lease on the Mumbles line.
We've got to get in the courtroom again, and we're talking.
And they won.
I direct that the Swansea Improvements and Tramway Company be granted the franchise to operate steam vehicles on the Oystermouth line.
This franchise was to run for 999 years.
I refuse the other applicants' leave to appeal.
Big money had done it, and the battle was settled forever. As the end of its first century approached, the Mumbles Railway proved difficult to assess. The railway that had started so hopefully in 1804 had seen closure, disruption and dispute. But the new lease and the extended line at least now held out the promise of stability. The Mumbles Railway went into the close of its first 100 years in the fervent hope that it had finally arrived. The new century began with the first of two royal visits, courtesy of the Mumbles Train. In July 1904,
My Lord Mayor and gentlemen, His Majesty King Edward VII.
and in July 1920,
My Lords, King George V. God save the King!
both monarchs were transported to their respective functions in specially decorated coaches of the Mumbles line. The year of that first royal visit also marked the first year of perhaps the most illustrious career ever served on the Mumbles Railway, that of ex-driver Frank Duncan. And he has recalled in print his memories of that time.
I began on the old steam train in 1904. I was 15. My first job was to sit on the toolbox in front of the engine and blow a whistle if anything strayed on the line. 2 blasts, and the driver would jam on the brakes of the train.
Compensation was paid at the rate of 10 shillings for a donkey and £1 for a cow. It was to be a compensation paid quite often in the early 1900s. Frank was promoted driver himself in 1911. With co-driver Bill Phillips, he presided over by far the busiest period of steam traction on the Mumbles line.
Holiday time was the biggest crush in those early years. On one particular day, in fact, we carried the record number of passengers ever carried on our type of train. 1,800 people on one trip.
The train developed its own special way of coping with this demand.
We had a huge cattle truck, as we called it, a big open carriage at the back of the Mumbles train. Hundreds of people could crowd in there when the rest of the carriages were full. The wind at the back of that train, it had to be felt to be believed.
But as recalled in print by Bill Phillips, this lack of comfort was compensated in part by the trackside entertainment.
The sight people always remember from those years is the young boys who used to run alongside the Mumbles line as the train went by. Dozens of them, turning cartwheels and somersaulting for pennies and halfpennies which people used to throw to them from the windows of the train. They even organised themselves into gangs. One working from Rutland Street to the Slip, another from the Slip to Bryn Mill, and so on they went down to the pier.
Halfpenny or a penny, they used to shout. Halfpenny or a penny. Halfpenny or a penny as the train went by. And the people were very generous to those boys. even though they often couldn't easily afford the pennies they'd throw. But for years those boys continued with their tricks and jumps.
1900, in fact, was to be a settled and prosperous period in the history of the Mumbles line. The promise of the new lease and line was to hold good for the early years of the new century. But it was not to escape change for long. In the middle of the 1920s, the Ministry of Transport approved the following order.
The Oystermouth Railway Electrical Power Order, 1925.
This 1925 order was conceived with a specific purpose.
This order is to facilitate the introduction of electrical power on certain of the railways or tram roads worked by the Swansea Improvements and Tramways Company.
As a spokesman for the Improvements Company made clear, this proposed change had been in the air for some time.
The first plan to electrify Swansea and Mumbles Railway was actually laid before Swansea Corporation in 1896. The electrification of the street tramway system was inaugurated in 1900, and the possibility of electrifying the railway had been under constant review since then.
Several meetings were held to discuss the electrification scheme between 1900 and 1910, though no real conclusions were reached. Much had been expected from a meeting to be attended by the Swansea Parliamentary Committee and the General Manager of the Improvements Company on the 16th of January, 1915. But other activities caused the issue to be shelved. The plans for the electrification scheme dragged on until 1918, when an apparently unrelated event took place.
It shall now be known that the Swansea Corporation shall comprise the areas bounded by Gower Street to the southwest and to Hartley Parade, which lies
in
to
1918, the local boundaries of Swansea were redrawn. The new Swansea Corporation, which now took over the area served by the railway, lost no time in making the support of the electrification scheme well known. And this infusion of fresh blood then encouraged one other.
The directors of the Swansea Improvements and Tramways Company apply that from henceforth all their interests are merged with and assume the title of the South Wales Transport Company.
This merger, in 1926, between the Improvements Company and the South Wales Transport Company was to be crucial in later years. But now it added financial resources to the local goodwill, and it clinched the switch to electric power. Frank Duncan again.
It was a bit sad to see the old steam train go in 1929. But nothing really unusual happened when it did. There was no ceremony, no parade. The old steam engine simply went into the shed, and the next morning, the first electric train came out. And that was that.
This time, the change in locomotion brought no legal battles. The most immediate effect of the new electric train, in fact, was to increase the already booming volume of passenger traffic. In 1925, under steam, there were 690,000 passengers per year. In 1938, after electrification, this figure had doubled to well over 1 million. These 1 million passengers were transported, moreover, on the biggest electrically driven tramway cars ever built for service in Great Britain. With the new speed of the electric trains, the journey from Rutland Street to Mumbles Pier was cut to just 18 minutes, and the trains increased to run every quarter of an hour. They made a memorable ride, a ride that's remembered in its every detail by Winford Vaughan Thomas.
The journey began at Rutland Street, and Rutland Street hadn't really changed much from the days of the steam train. Of course, the new electric trams were there, and we took pride in the fact that they were supposed to be the biggest trams ever built in Europe. They weren't exactly the fastest because the track had inherited itself from the old steam days, and it was definitely a rock and roll ride to paradise that you got on Mumbles Railway, even under steam and under electric traction. But clang went the doors, and away you went. First of all, from Rutland Street to the Slip. An interesting section, this, because on your other side, nearest to the sea, you had the old LMS train, and you raced along, keeping pace with a flyer to Pontedillis, throwing steam over its shoulder on the other side. And if you turn inland and looked at the town side, great excitements. You passed the jail, and you could almost just look over the wall and see the upper rows of cells. Rather sad, you felt, must never get there. Make certain at all costs you stay out of jail. And on we went then to the Slip. The Slip was, well, it was a more important stop than Rutland Street. From Rutland Street you got the people from the valleys getting in, even from the Strand. But there was a better class of passenger we always felt joining at the Slip. And of course Bryn Mill with the Crachach came in from the uplands. On from the Slip, and the Slip, by the way, was always a patronised place, although the corporation built that enormous miniature fourth bridge to carry the holidaymakers over the crowded Gower and then Mumbles Road. Everybody still patronised the Slip and waited for the gates to be opened on the LMS line and then on to the Sands. The Sands crowded in summer, and in Sundays you could look down and there would be the orators. It was Swansea's Hyde Park corner, the Slip. From the Slip, past St. Helens, and if you're lucky you looked up and there on the Glamorgan were playing, there were people on the little railway passenger bridge getting a free peep into Glamorgan. From the train you could never quite see what the score was. It went a little too fast. Then you hit Promenade, the Prom. There was a crossover here, and the other trains were waiting on the other line, but you went rocking gently along beside the Promenade, the source of my first amorous adventures in youth, because in those days the girls walked down one side, the men walked down the other. Men, we were 15, 16, 17, we thought we were men, we actually smoked. And out of the voice, muffled voices would come out of the dark. Hello, how are you? Going anywhere? There you are. All right, don't mind if I do. And you disappeared gently along the railway side, under Blackpill Tunnel, where, of course, on while high tides, the waters actually came over the railway line. And the great excitement was to watch the high tide pouring through the narrow archway under the LMS bridge, right over the tracks of the Mumbles Railway. From there on, you followed the line. There was no new section of the Prom in those days, it was just sand dunes. And you looked inland and there were the beautiful delights of Singleton and Singleton Abbey. You suddenly remembered it was built on copper money, and the Vivians and the Dilwins and the rest of them. They built themselves a very nice snuggery. And you could still see the Abbey as an Abbey in those days because the expansion in education explosion hadn't occurred. And there wasn't any vast structure campuses at Swansea University. It was all lovely parkland green fields. Then on you went aiming at Blackpill. And on the left-hand side, of course, there was the golf course run by Mr. Boone, who had a little hut near the bridge over when the LMS line went into Clyne Valley, and there he stood, and for sixpence you could have a round, and you had one club only. I think it was known in those days as a clique, and you chipped your shots round through the bunkers. It's all very municipal now, isn't it? All very swagger, but in Mr. Boone's day, if you could get round the Blackpill golf course, it was known as a golf course, well, you could really enter yourself for any championship in the world, I reckon, if you got round without losing a ball either on the Mumbles Railway side or the LMS side. But at Blackpill, the LMS line finally left you, crossed over the bridge that they've just pulled down and over into Clyne Valley. Then the Mumbles line was then alone in its glory. A stop at Blackpill, and you then went on a rather mysterious section of the line, because the road had disappeared, and in between the road and you, there were the gardens of houses, the built in the days when Swansea and Mumbles line was a marina. And it's here you first realised the beauty of Swansea Bay, because you could look out from the upper floor. You always travelled in the upper section of the train, of course. That was the great delight. You could look out over things, and you look then across the level tides in the summer of Swansea Bay. This marvellous curve. And the big works hadn't started to grow in those days. You could look across to Port Talbot, Neath.
Ex-Mayor of Swansea, Werner Sivertson.
The main thing about the old Mumbles train in those years was that it simply never missed. Every 10 minutes throughout the Blitz, throughout the bombings, throughout the entire duration of the war, the train clattered out of Rutland Street and ran down to Mumbles Pier. It didn't run on the road, so the raids didn't affect it. And it didn't run on fuel, so the rationing didn't affect it either. And more to the point, people knew it wouldn't be affected. And that was terribly important then. Come what may, people felt that Swansea had one transport system that was not going to fail them. And I think it secured the train, once and for all, in the hearts of local people.
In 1954, the Mumbles Railway was 150 years old. It had run along the Mumbles foreshore for 6 generations. It had been Swansea's only reliable means of transport through 2 world wars, and had carried the record number of passengers anywhere in the world in both its steam and electric eras. The South Wales Transport Company organised an impressive celebration.
For the 150th anniversary of the Mumbles Railway, the South Wales Transport Company announced the following programme of events.
Their programme was to begin with a historic procession.
At 11:20 a.m., a horse-drawn train of the early 19th century will travel from Oystermouth Station to Southend. This will be followed by a steam train to commemorate the transition from horse to steam traction in 1877. To complete this procession, there will be an electric train representing the introduction of electric power in 1929.
This procession was timed to run immediately before a commemoration luncheon held in the Guildhall that day and addressed by the Minister of Transport, Anthony Lennox Boyd.
As many of those present here know, Mr. Mayor, I began my political career on Gower some 25 years ago. As many of those present here also know, I used the Mumbles train regularly then and have used the train on countless occasions since. And I can tell you now that my affection for the Mumbles train and my gratitude for the service it provides is matched only by the happiness it has brought to hundreds of thousands of visitors to our town.
He was thanked by the chairman of the South Wales Transport Company, Mr. W.T. James.
The people of Swansea and the people of Wales can take pride in the possession of this train, Mr. Lennox Boyd, the first passenger train in the world. As lessees of this line, my company share some of that pride. We share, too, a pride in the survival of this railway as an independent line. The Mumbles Railway is the oldest railway in the world to retain its separate identity under that form of enterprise which has given Britain and the rest of the world transport systems which are the lifeblood of modern civilization.
Outside the Guildhall, the celebrations had by now swung fully into life, and it was an impressive display. Band concerts and dance displays lit up the whole of the western foreshore, while yacht races and special lifeboat launches sustained the drama for the crowds that had gathered around the bay. Throughout the afternoon, Mumbles villagers in period dress formed the protagonists in the procession that had first run that morning, a procession that would transport enthusiasts all day along that Mumbles track. Exhibitions and parades completed a day's programme that was not to end till many hours later, when at the special celebration dance in the Pier Hotel, the crowds, the luncheon guests, the dignitaries and the helpers were to take part in a dance that ran till dawn. Before they left to join the festivities, those guests heard the day's formal declaration, delivered by the Mayor of Swansea, T.S. Harris.
This day is one of the greatest anniversaries in the history of Swansea. One thing has become clear to me, gentlemen, and must become clear to everyone who attends the activities of this historic day, that the foundation of the Mumbles Railway is an example of that progress and enterprise that marches forward and renews its purpose in the face of any and all opposition.
It became an extraordinary day. But the 150th anniversary of the Mumbles Railway marked the end of one stage in its story, as well as commemorating its beginning. It had seen innovation, and it had seen excitement. The next stage in its story was to run for only 6 more years. But it was to tell a very different tale. The Evening Post of the 23rd of September, 1958.
An offer today by the South Wales Transport Company to buy the 154-year-old Mumbles Railway is being interpreted in some quarters as the first step in scrapping the ancient line. Questioned today, the General Manager of the Transport Company, Mr. H. Weedy, would not comment on this report.
The South Wales Transport Company were, of course, still lessees of the Mumbles line. They operated the lease from the line's 2 owners, the Swansea and Mumbles Railway Company and the Mumbles Railway and Pier Company.
Gentlemen.
R.K. Bellingham was chairman of these 2 companies.
Gentlemen, the offer for our companies comprise the following. The Swansea and Mumbles Railway Company, for each £1 of the 4% debenture stock, the South Wales Transport Company will pay the sum of 18 shillings. For the Mumbles Railway and Pier Company, for each £10 4% preference share, the sum on offer is £7.17 and 6pence. Your directors, gentlemen, strongly recommend acceptance of this offer. The amounts named in this offer are better than the prices obtained for these shares on sale and transfer during recent years. And your directors believe that the money received by this sale may be reinvested in securities, providing a better return.
This recommendation was put to the vote.
Aye.
The offer was accepted. The South Wales Transport Company were now in sole charge of the Mumbles Train. But even now, the intentions of the Transport Company were not clear. After all, why should the Transport Company want to close the Mumbles line? Who would benefit from the closure of the 150-year-old railway? British Electric Traction would, the parent company of South Wales Transport, and by 1958, one of the country's largest manufacturers of motor buses. The South Wales Transport Company assumed control of the Mumbles line in October 1958. In November 1958, an application on behalf of the company was submitted to the House of Lords.
My Lords, Order number 5128, the South Wales Transport Bill.
The title of this bill, in fact, gave no hint as to its purpose. The terms of this bill, as first phrased, were ambiguous. The bill was, further, submitted under a scheme of private sponsorship, which meant that its passage would receive no publicity. Undetected and unobserved by any interested party, the South Wales Transport Bill passed its first reading in the Upper House.
Object! 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 Object!
But by its second reading, two peers, Lords Merivale and Ogmore, had investigated and divined the real purpose of the application that was proceeding unhampered through the chamber.
Object! Object!
Object, my lord.
Object!
Which was to close the Mumbles Train.
Our meeting will be held in the Regent Casino, Mumbles, to discuss the closure of the Mumbles Railway.
A meeting will be held in the Pier Hotel to discuss the closure...
A meeting will be held in the Beaufort Hall to discuss the closure of the Mumbles Railway. Speakers will include Dr. Robinson of the Light Railway Transport League and Hugh Rees, prospective parliamentary candidate for the Swansea West constituency.
The local protest organised itself quickly.
Our concern, Mr. Chairman, is not with the Mumbles line as a museum piece, but with its potential as a modern method of passenger travel. The Mumbles line has a 939-year lease, runs on a separate track from the road, runs on a fuel source that is homegrown and easily available, has, in fact, all the potential for high speed and comfort that is the hallmark of many modernized electric tramways in Europe.
I'd like to agree with Dr. Robinson, Mr. Chairman. We don't have a dog's chance of keeping the railway on sentimental grounds, but we have a strong case for the retention of the line on the practical grounds of deteriorating road safety should it close. The issue is not just a sentimental one, but nor is it merely a business debate. It is a question of whether it is in public interest that this railway should be retained or allowed to close.
Throughout the spring of 1959, the argument between the protest movement and the South Wales Transport Company raged in public meetings up and down the western foreshore.
It is simple mathematics, Mr. Chairman. A new railway coach would cost my company in excess of £40,000, while a new motor bus would cost £6.
These are figures, Mr. Chairman, for the latest articulated trains in experiment on the continent. These are not figures for coaches on the Mumbles line.
Is Dr. Robinson trying to say that a new railway coach costs less than a new motor bus?
It costs, as the transport company full well know, £14,000 and not 40. More than a motor bus, I agree. But as the transport company also full well knows, the capacity of a railway coach is far in excess of that of a motor bus.
And it carries those passengers, Mr. Chairman, on a service that is not subject to any traffic delays, is flexible in its departure points, and is large enough to transport any cases, bags or prams that those passengers may wish to transport, and in none of these cases can the same be said for a motor bus.
These public meetings that began in January were followed hard by a petition in March organised by the residents of Mumbles that raised 14,000 signatures in support of the train. At the end of March, associated petitions sprang up in different parts of Wales and on throughout the British Isles. In April, the texts of hundreds of letters were released that had flooded into the Mumbles Railway Association from as far afield as India, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. The biggest public meeting at the end of April then sent its most vocal resolution to South Wales Transport and to Lord Brecon, the Minister of State for Wales.
This resolution, gentlemen, deplores the action by the South Wales Transport Company in attempting to close the Mumbles Railway and urges the South Wales Transport Company to retain and modernise the service provided by the Mumbles Train.
But these protests and public meetings on their own would never be enough.
The South Wales Transport Company, gentlemen, believe that the transport service for the people of Swansea and Mumbles will be improved immeasurably by the substitution of motor buses for the Mumbles Train.
The protest movement in Swansea and Mumbles had to effect the passage of the South Wales Transport Bill in Parliament. And the most critical time for that was to come in its committee hearing in the House of Lords that May.
My lords, this is a committee hearing to investigate the order number 5128, the South Wales Transport Bill.
Why was this hearing so critical? The committee hearing is defined as the stage in the passage of a private bill at which those interested parties whose property or pecuniary interests might be affected by its passage can present their objections. It is, in fact, the major chance for local protest to make itself heard, and it was the major hope for the present movement in Swansea and Mumbles.
7 parties have applied to give evidence, my lords. The Light Railway Transport League of Cricklewood, London, the Mumbles Railway Passenger Association.
The protest here was to be headed by 2 main bodies.
But 2 principal parties have been approved to give evidence, my lords. The Amusement Equipment Company, who operate the Mumbles Hotel and Pier, and the Swansea Borough Council.
The Amusement Equipment Company had been concerned from the outset at the effect the closure would have on the business life of the Mumbles. They had taken an active part in the protest meetings and petitions organised in the area from January to April that year. Their own protest, indeed, had involved the engagement of specialist legal counsel to present and to argue their documents and depositions. But the careful preparations of the Amusement Equipment Company were to receive a setback the night before the hearing took place. The manager of their Pier Hotel was Jack Bartlett.
An extraordinary thing happened the night before the committee hearing. The directors of the Amusement Equipment Company had travelled from all over the country for the hearing, and we'd arranged to meet in our council's chambers at Whitehall at 5 o'clock the night before to be briefed by our barrister on the tactics and procedure for the following day.
This was standard procedure. What happened next was not.
Well, we assembled, and then we waited, and we waited. And then, after about an hour or so, a note was handed in to the chairman of our company. And he stood up, and he said, "Gentlemen, I don't quite understand this." And then he stopped and started, and eventually he said, "But it appears our barrister has quit our case."
The directors of the Amusement Equipment Company were left, in fact, without any legal representation, a matter of hours before their evidence was due to be heard. As the protagonists in the committee hearing took their places the next day, that news had filtered through to all the interested parties. It was obvious now to everyone in that chamber that the burden of fighting the closure would have to now fall full on the shoulders of the second group of objectors, the Swansea Borough Council.
My lords, barrister of the Swansea Borough Council.
But the burden of fighting the closure, of course, did not fall full on the shoulders of the Swansea Borough Council. For what the Swansea Borough Council did at the start of that hearing was this.
Your Lordships, I wish to bring it to your attention that I am here this morning on behalf of the Swansea Borough Council, and I would like to say from the outset that the Swansea Borough Council do not object in any way to the closure of the Mumbles Railway.
And one thing should be made absolutely clear. The major protesters who travelled to the House of Lords in May 1959 had no idea that the Swansea Borough Council were not to pursue their opposition to the closure of the Mumbles Railway in the House of Lords itself. For the Amusement Equipment Company in particular, the first that they knew of the withdrawal of their major ally, and indeed the first they knew of the disappearance of their barrister, came in both instances when it was effectively too late to organise any other.
You are Mr. H. Weedy, the General Manager of the South Wales Transport Company?
I am, sir.
It was an extraordinary start to the hearing. But there was to be no time for recriminations. With the withdrawal of the Swansea Borough Council, the chief witness of the transport company took the floor.
I would like to ask you some questions, Mr. Weedy, about the somewhat desperate financial state of this railway.
Of course.
With now no effective professional opposition to examine him. But the South Wales Transport Company were not to have it completely their own way. For another of the protesters present at that hearing, The Light Railway Transport League did examine Mr. Weedy's evidence later, and they published their examination in that same year. These are their results.
I am correct, Mr. Weedy, that your company estimates that a capital investment of £261,000 is required to finance the repair and restitution of the line and the rolling stock of this railway.
That is correct, sir. And my company does not have that money.
The South Wales Transport Company did not have that money, of course, because in 1958 they had paid in excess of £200,000 to buy the railway, on which, up to then, they had only operated the lease. So their purchase of the railway from its two former owners some 2 years before had not only given the South Wales Transport Company the right to determine the future of the railway, it had also deprived them of the cash reserves necessary to keep it running.
Could you tell me, Mr. Weedy, whether the Mumbles Railway is at present making a profit?
It is not, sir. In fact, it is making a loss. And the loss for this year will be in the order of £8,500.
But a study of the company accounts for the year of 1959 reveals that even though they now owned the line, the South Wales Transport had still charged the railway with the rental due under the old lease. The South Wales Transport Company were, in effect, charging themselves rent. The rental that they charged was £13,900. This meant that the much publicised loss of £8,500 in 1959, had they not deducted that rent, would have been a profit for the undertaking of £5,500.
Should this line close, Mr. Weedy, would the passengers benefit directly from the substitution of motor buses?
Oh, they would indeed. My company proposed massive reductions in fares for the new road service. Indeed, with the line converted to motor buses, there will be a reduction in the price of 3 monthly season tickets of as much as £2.
In fact, a financial extrapolation of basic fares, even had it been undertaken then, would have revealed that of 85 basic fares, 34 would remain unchanged, 11 would be slightly reduced, and 40 would be increased. It is a matter of record that this became the case. It is a further matter of record that, with the bill safely passed, Mr. Weedy's much publicised saving of as much as £2 never appeared.
Would the amusement equipment company care to examine the evidence cited by the South Wales Transport Company?
No, my lord.
But why did the Amusement Equipment Company not examine the Transport Company on these figures? Even without professional representation, even without the support of the Swansea Borough Council, why did they not draw the Lord's attention to the statements made by Mr. Weedy on the financial state of the company's accounts? Again, the Light Railway League provided a possible answer.
One might have thought that with the position in some doubt, the South Wales Transport Company would have been ready to produce accounts to clarify matters. But from the beginning of this unhappy affair to the end, no accounts were in fact produced. Even the requirements of the Companies Act were flouted in that no accounts were filed with the Registrar of Companies since 1956. That the South Wales Transport Company should abstain from doing this while promoting their legislation indicates how assured they were of their position.
We direct that order number 5128, the South Wales Transport Bill, be approved by this committee.
From its committee stage in the Lords, the South Wales Transport Bill was passed back to its third reading in the House itself. Lord Merivale here continued his opposition, and 4 MPs did petition against the bill as it appeared before the Commons. It was to be to no avail. In July 1959, the bill passed its third reading in the Commons and was passed back to the Lords. The bill was approved on the same day and was 2 days later granted royal assent. 1 day before Parliament rose for the summer recess, the South Wales Transport Bill became law. With the bill passed on to the statute book, the storm in Swansea and Mumbles broke. 2 major issues erupted. Why did the barrister representing the Amusement Equipment Company leave the case so abruptly and with such devastating timing the night before the Lord's hearing took place? To this day, the chief witness for the amusement equipment company, Jack Bartlett, doesn't know. So why did the Swansea Borough Council abandon their opposition to the closure of the line? Before we answer that, one point should be made. To be strictly fair to the Swansea Borough Council, they actually kept their petition against the South Wales Transport Bill in Parliament after that House of Lords hearing in May. They kept their petition in fact, while they held discussions with the South Wales Transport Company, though it was to have little effect in saving the line. And the result of those discussions, indeed, was that they finally withdrew their opposition as the South Wales Transport Bill appeared before the House of Commons in June. The question remains, of course, why? Why did the Swansea Borough Council withdraw their objections? A spokesman for the Swansea Borough Council said,
"We had opposed the South Wales Transport Company's bill at every possible stage until it became obvious that the concessions of the South Wales Transport Company had deprived the Swansea Borough Council of all authority and argument."
The last chapter in the story of the railway was then reported in the South Wales Evening Post, some 2 months later.
23rd of September 1959. It was announced last night by the Swansea Town Clerk, Mr. T.B. Bowen, that when the ancient Mumbles Railway is abandoned and modern buses take its place, then all the land owned by the railway operators, the South Wales Transport Company, and additional land adjoining the railway is to be given free of charge by the South Wales Transport Company to Swansea Borough Council.
Though the fate of the railway was now decided, the residents of Mumbles were determined that the train should not go quietly. Mumbles housewife, Veronica Barrington.
When we realised the railway was going to close, there was nothing to be done, we decided to organise a last ceremonial trip on the train. We hired 2 coaches for a last private run for the people of Swansea and Mumbles. That was in the last few days of 1959.
This trip was then arranged to run after the last service run at 11:30 p.m. on the 4th of January 1960. As a theatrical event, it was to match all the careful preparations of 1954.
The whole event was planned as a full-scale funeral procession. We dressed in widow's weeds, in mourning clothes, we carried mourning cards, and we chanted funeral dirges. We also had a lone trumpeter playing the last post and a coffin which we carried onto the train.
As a final touch, the drivers and conductors of the railway, Frank Duncan included, were contracted to give the train this, its most colourful goodbye.
Hundreds of people turned up just to watch, even if they couldn't get on the train. I had received letters from hundreds of miles away for people begging for tickets for that last trip. We could have filled 50 coaches, never mind 2. But I don't think any of us really thought that people would travel the length and breadth of the country just for that last 20-minute trip on the old Mumbles train.
Those who did receive tickets for the last trip found them inscribed with a farewell rhyme.
See the train going down the track. It's sad to think it will not come back. It's running now for the very last time, for they are closing the oldest line.
The night of the 4th of January arrived appropriately enough, with one of the heaviest downpours the residents of Mumbles can remember. The lights of the television cameras filming the parade floodlit the gleaming red train as the funeral party began their final procession. Each carriage was packed to capacity as the ceremonial coffin was loaded onto the front car, to the accompaniment of hundreds of motorists tooting a cacophony of car horns, and to the cheers of the assembled crowds on the trackside. The Mumbles train rocked and rolled back along the track it had travelled for 156 years. The next day, the 5th of January, the last service run took place. School children left their classrooms and local people lined the streets. Pennies were put on the line to be flattened as souvenirs. The carriages were packed with invited dignitaries. And among the crowds and the lights, the decorations and displays, enjoying the occasion, in fact, as much as any of the other invited guests, were, of course, the very councillors and council appointees whose actions had led to the closure of the line they were now so busy celebrating. The end of the story? Not quite. In August 1975, advertisements began to appear in the national press.
Hallmark Replicas Limited London proudly offer for sale gold-plated reproductions of the post office stamps to commemorate the world's first public railway, which came into being at Stockton and Darlington 150 years ago in 1825.
Tony Cottle, chairman of the Mumbles Railway Society.
I was absolutely incensed when I read this. You see, over the last 15 years, the railway itself had closed.
In March 1977, a proposal by the Mumbles Railway Society that the Mumbles Railway be reopened was considered by Swansea City Council. The last estimate of cost was £70,000 per mile. The issue was deferred by Swansea City Council and is at present being held in limbo. So, is this the end of the story? It's as well to remember that the Mumbles Railway closed once before, for a 33-year gap between 1827 and 1860. Is it possible that the present is again a temporary pause? Could the Mumbles train, as it did before, revive? Be running again along the Mumbles foreshore in, say, 1993?
Oh, the trains will run again, those in Parliament Lane. Progress means highway big and wide. But if I only could, then I know I surely would board Mumbles train and take another ride. Oh, those winds across the bay, how they make track a sway to a rock and roll and rolling walking beat. But she stayed upon the track and she took us there and back, while the passengers, they fought to keep their seats. Oh, the trains will run again, those in Parliament Lane. Progress means highway big and wide. But if I only could, then I know I surely would board the Mumbles train and take another ride. Still remember doing some, no, I'm not the only one to say upon farewell to that old train. They go into the moon, listen to that sonic boom, but never see the light of her again. Oh, the trains will run again, those in Parliament Lane. Progress means a highway big and wide. But if I only could, then I know I surely would board the Mumbles train and take another ride. Pulled by horses, pushed by steam, she was sea-time morning queen of the 5 mile sunshine 56.5. Then in 1929, she went electric, well that's fine. 1960, she got married before she died. Oh, the trains will run again, those in Parliament Lane. Progress means highway big and wide. But if I only could, then I know I surely would board the Mumbles train and take another ride. Then came one summer's day, they came and took the trains away. Underneath the lights I couldn't see the show. To the museum we thought they'd go, the oldest passenger train to show. But they sent those trains right up in bloody snow. Trains will run again, those power made it plain. Progress means a highway big and wide. But if I only could, then I know I surely would. For the Mumbles Train to take another ride. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum.
A Rock and Roll to Paradise, a dramatised history of the establishment, life and closure of the Mumbles Railway, the first passenger railway in the world. It was written and compiled by Rob Gittins. The narrator was Gareth Hughes, and you heard the voices of Jack Bartlett, Veronica Barrington, Tony Cottle, Winford Vaughan Thomas, and members of the Swansea Little Theatre. The engineers were John Daniels and Beverly Lewis, and the producer was Wyn Thomas.